It's 1941. Paris is under Nazi occupation. Every factory in France is being watched. German officers walk the floors of the Renault plant at Billancourt, and one rule is absolute. No French company is allowed to design a new civilian car. Not a sketch, not a mock-up, not a single blueprint. And yet, inside that same factory, a small group of engineers is doing exactly that. They're not doing it for money. They're not doing it for fame. They're doing it because one man is convinced that when the war ends, France is going to need something nobody in charge is thinking about. A cheap, simple, reliable car that an ordinary family can actually afford. If German inspectors find out, the project ends. Possibly worse. So how do you build a car nobody is allowed to build, inside a factory controlled by the people banning it? And how does that secret project go on to become the first French car in history to cross 1 million units sold? That's the story of the Renault 4CV. And it starts with one engineer, hiding in plain sight. His name was Fernand Picard. In October 1940, just months after France surrendered, Picard began quietly sketching out an idea. He believed the coming peace would bring poverty, fuel shortages, and a country desperate for basic transportation. Big luxury sedans wouldn't sell. What people would need was something small, light, and cheap to run. The problem was, this was the exact opposite of what Renault's founder wanted. Louis Renault, the man whose name was on the building, had spent his whole career building bigger, more powerful cars. He saw personal automobiles as premium products, not something for working-class families. A tiny economy car wasn't just uninteresting to him. It went against everything he believed the Renault name stood for. So Picard didn't ask permission. He and a colleague, Charles Edmond Serra, who ran engineering and research at the company, decided to build the car in secret, hidden from the Germans who had banned it, and hidden from their own boss, who would have shut it down anyway. They gave it a deliberately boring internal name, Project 106E. On paper, it looked like nothing more than routine engine testing for an existing model. In reality, it was the birth of an entirely new car. By February 1942, they were secretly bench testing a small 760 cubic centimeters four-cylinder engine inside the plant. 10 months later, in December 1942, they had something remarkable, a complete working prototype. 2 doors, a lightweight aluminum body, and the engine mounted in the back. It looked strikingly similar to another small rear-engine car being developed at the same time in Germany, the Volkswagen Beetle. But this one was being built by Frenchmen, under the noses of the people who had outlawed it. Then, in May 1941, the thing they feared most happened. Louis Renault walked in and caught them. He found Picard and Serra standing over a wooden mock-up of an engine they had no authorization to be building. This should have been the end of it. Instead, something unexpected happened. Renault didn't shut it down. He still didn't believe in the idea. He still thought small economy cars were beneath his company. But he let them continue, on the condition that officially, on paper, this was nothing more than an engine study for one of his existing models. He gave them just enough cover to keep working, without ever really backing the project himself. And there was a second layer of danger they had to get past, the Germans themselves. The Billancourt plant was under the direct supervision of a German administrator, a Mercedes-Benz engineer named Prince Wilhelm von Urach, who had been sent to enforce Nazi production priorities. Von Urach had the authority to end Project 106 the moment he suspected what it really was. But he was also a Francophile, someone with genuine affection for French culture. According to the historical record, he chose to look the other way. He knew, or at least suspected, what Picard's team was really doing. And he said nothing. So picture what was actually happening inside that factory. A secret prototype, disguised as engine research, tolerated by a boss who didn't believe in it, and overlooked by an occupying officer who wasn't supposed to allow it. 3 separate points of failure, and none of them brought the project down. In January 1943, the team took their prototype out for its first real test, at night, on quiet rural roads outside the factory, to avoid being seen. It hit 52 miles per hour. For a car built in secret out of scrap resources during a military occupation, that was a genuine result. But the danger wasn't over. In March 1943, Allied bombing raids struck the Billancourt complex. The prototype survived only because it had been hidden away in a peripheral storage shed, tucked out of sight of both the bombs and the Germans. By March 1944, they had built a second, improved prototype, steel body panels this time instead of aluminum, and revised styling up front to make it look less like the German design it was sometimes compared to. Then, in August 1944, everything changed. Paris was liberated. German control of the factory ended. And a few months later, in January 1945, the French government nationalized Renault entirely, turning it into a state-owned company under a new name, the Régie Nationale des Usines Renault, or RNUR. Louis Renault himself never saw any of what came next. He was arrested shortly after the liberation and would not live to see his own company reshaped around a car he never wanted built. The man who took over was named Pierre Lefaucheux, a former resistance leader turned engineer, now running one of the largest industrial companies in France. When he looked at Picard's secret prototype, he immediately understood something Louis Renault never had. This wasn't a side project. This was exactly the car post-war France needed. But Lefaucheux also saw a problem. The prototype only had 2 doors. For a company car meant to move real families, that wasn't going to work. So he made a decision that reshaped the entire project, rebuilt it as a proper 4-door sedan. That meant lengthening the floor pan, redesigning the entire body structure, and adding 2 more doors without losing structural strength. The team solved it by building the body as a single, fully integrated steel shell, a monocoque, strong enough to handle the extra doors without extra weight. The front doors opened forward from a rear hinge, an old-fashioned suicide door style, while the rear doors hinged normally. By early 1946, a batch of 40 pre-production cars was already being tested on roads across France and in French North Africa. There was one more strange chapter before the car reached the public. Late in 1945, the French government asked the legendary engineer Ferdinand Porsche, yes, that Porsche, to inspect the nearly finished car and offer his opinion. Lefaucheux was furious about it. He saw no reason to bring in outside advice on a design his own team had already finalized. Porsche sat through 9 review sessions, and in the end, his suggestions were essentially ignored. The finished 4CV owed nothing to Porsche. Its architecture, its layout, its entire identity had already been locked in by Fernand Picard and body designer Roger Barhaud years earlier, while Porsche was nowhere near France. That detail matters, because for decades afterward, a myth persisted that Porsche secretly designed the 4CV while being held in France after the war, or that Renault simply copied the Volkswagen Beetle. Neither is true. The car existed, in prototype form, before Porsche ever set foot near the project. What people were really seeing was 2 separate teams, in 2 separate countries, arriving at a similar idea, a small, light, rear-engined economy car, because the engineering logic pointed the same direction. On October 3, 1946, the finished 4-door 4CV was revealed publicly for the first time at the Paris Motor Show. And even then, it needed one more thing before it could go into full production: raw materials. Post-war France was desperately short on steel, rubber, and coal. So the government created something called the Plan Pons, a system that decided which manufacturer got to build which type of car, based on assigned material allocations. The original plan wasn't even written in Renault's favor. Small economy cars were supposed to go to Citroën, whose own project would eventually become the 2CV. Renault was meant to focus on trucks and larger sedans instead. Lefaucheux wasn't willing to accept that. He brought in a statistician named Georges Toublanc, who had compiled market research showing that French demand for a small 4-horsepower class car was enormous, over 450,000 units, far beyond what Citroën alone could realistically build. Toublanc also showed that Renault's Billancourt plant could be modernized to build more than 600 cars a day. Faced with those numbers, the government changed course and gave Renault the material allocation it needed to build the 4CV at scale. With materials secured, Lefaucheux modernized the entire Billancourt factory, importing new machine tools and building automated transfer lines that could drill, mill, and tap engine parts with far less manual labor than before. It was a full commitment to American-style mass production on French soil for a French car. Serial production finally began on August 12, 1947. The very first day, the plant produced just 15 cars. 15 cars a day doesn't sound like the beginning of a legend, but it was. By 1949, daily output had climbed past 300 units, and the 4CV had already become the best-selling car in France. In January 1950, the 100,000th unit rolled off the line. A year later, in March 1951, they hit 200,000. Then 300,000 in March 1952. Then 400,000 the year after that. Renault sold the car with a slogan that told buyers exactly what they were getting, in one breath. For doors, for seats, for CV, for 140,000 francs. For doors, for seats, for horsepower, in the French tax classification. And a price of 440,000 francs, the cheapest four-door sedan available in the country. Mechanically, the 4CV was more sophisticated than its price tag suggested. Power came from a small liquid-cooled four-cylinder engine, codenamed VIN2, mounted behind the rear axle. At launch it displaced 760 cubic centimeters and produced 17 horsepower, modest numbers, but enough to move a car this light. In late 1950, engineers actually reduced the displacement slightly, down to 747 cubic centimeters, specifically to fit under international motorsport rules for the under 750cc class. That small change, done for racing purposes, also happened to push output up to 21 horsepower on the standard version, and as high as 28 to 32 horsepower on the sport-tuned 1063 variants that Renault built for competition. Underneath the low price was genuinely clever engineering. Because the engine was mounted longitudinally behind the rear axle instead of up front, there was no need for a bulky driveshaft tunnel running down the middle of the car. That meant a completely flat floor, which meant real space for four adults inside a car barely 12 feet long. At a curb weight of just over 1,200 pounds, the 4CV was also remarkably efficient, getting somewhere between 45 and 50 miles per gallon at a time when fuel in France was scarce and expensive. For working-class families who had just been granted guaranteed paid vacation time, and who suddenly had somewhere to drive to, the 4CV wasn't just a product. It was the thing that made the summer road trip possible for the first time. There's one more detail about those early cars that most owners never questioned at the time: their color. Many early 4CVs rolled off the line in a distinctive sand yellow shade, which earned the car an affectionate nickname, La Motte de Beurre, or the Pat of Butter. That color wasn't a styling decision. It was leftover paint. Specifically, surplus stock originally mixed for German Afrika Korps military vehicles, still sitting in tanks at the Billancourt factory after the occupation ended. Renault simply used what it already had. The car kept evolving through the 1950s in smaller ways too. In 1953, the front grille was redesigned, switching from 6 chrome bars down to a simpler 3-bar look. And in 1955, Renault introduced something genuinely ahead of its time for a budget car, an optional electromagnetic clutch system called Furlec, which let drivers change gears without pressing a clutch pedal at all. Even the entry-level Lux trim, back in 1948, had come with a Neiman steering column lock, one of the earliest anti-theft locks ever fitted to a mass-production European car. None of this was expected from a people's car. It was Renault quietly proving that cheap didn't have to mean primitive. The 4CV also found an unexpected second life away from the factory floor. The Italian coach builder Carrozzeria Ghia took the humble 4CV chassis and turned a limited number of them into open-air beach cars called the Jolly, doorless bodies, wicker seats, and a fringed canvas roof, sold as resort transportation for wealthy vacationers along the Mediterranean coast. It's a strange final chapter for a car that started life as a secret wartime engine study, but it says something about how far Picard's original idea had traveled. By the mid-1950s, the 4CV wasn't just a domestic success, it had crossed the Atlantic. Renault began officially exporting the car to the United States in 1948. But there was a marketing problem. Americans hearing the name 4CV might assume it meant a 4-horsepower engine, which sounded laughably weak. So in the US, Renault dropped the name entirely and simply sold the car as the Renault or the Renault 750. At a base price of $1,135, it was actually more expensive than some American economy options, like the Crosley station wagon. It was even priced close to a full-size Ford V 8 Coupe. What it offered instead was something most American cars of the era didn't: independent suspension, precise steering, and remarkable fuel economy. American road testers noticed. In 1949, journalist Tom McCahill tested the 4CV for Mechanics Illustrated during a snowstorm, while his usual American test cars struggled to get traction. The rear-engined Renault, with its weight sitting directly over the driven wheels, handled the snow with noticeably more confidence. Road and Track covered it too, later highlighting a factory-prepared 4CV that won its engine class outright at the 12 Hours of Sebring in 1955. The 4CV wasn't built for American highways, and its top speed of around 60 miles an hour made long interstate drives a real challenge. But it found its place anyway, as a practical second car for college professors, returning servicemen, and early sports car enthusiasts. It gave Renault its first real foothold in the American market, one that would later pave the way for the Renault Dauphine. Back in Europe, the 4CV wasn't just proving itself on the street, it was winning on the track. It took its class at the Monte Carlo Rally in 1949 and again at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1950. One young racing driver, Jean Riedel, liked the little Renault's mechanical components so much that he began building lightweight sports cars around them. That project eventually grew into its own company, Alpine, one of the most respected names in French motorsport history, and it all traces back to a car that started life as a wartime secret. Production of the 4CV continued for 14 years. Late in 1960, or in the very earliest days of 1961, the millionth 4CV rolled off the Billancourt line, the first French car in history to ever reach that number. The very last one, unit number 1,105,547, was built on July 6, 1961. Think about where this car actually began. A band idea, sketched by an engineer who wasn't supposed to be designing anything. Built under cover of a fake engine study. Tolerated by a boss who didn't believe in it, and overlooked by an occupying officer who wasn't supposed to allow it. Bombed, hidden, redesigned twice, second-guessed by one of the most famous engineers in the world, and it still became the car that put an entire country back on wheels. If you want to see where that story goes next, the car that eventually replaced the 4CV on the Billancourt line has its own strange history, the Renault Dauphine, and how it nearly took over the American market before it all fell apart. That's a story worth watching too. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, drop a comment with what car history you want covered next, and subscribe for more of these deep dives.